Hi everyone, Alan here with our regular Monday night Discovering Buddhism class. Good to be with you. Hope you're well. Hopefully we'll make it through the class without a break in our live streaming. We'll battle on. If we do miss out on, say, the meditation at the end, I'll send you a written copy of it so you could do it at home, which is what happened last week from what I remember. Also, just a reminder that we won't have a class next week because it's Labor Day, public holiday. So next class after this will be the week after that. So hopefully you'll have a time to do a bit of reading, read some of the documents I sent you yesterday. This is a new topic today, presenting the path. And it's interesting because it's like an overview of the rest of the course, which is really basic Buddhist teachings, usually called the lamrim in Tibetan, lamrim, basic Buddhist teachings. And we'll just be looking at probably today, this particular class will be just focusing mainly on history of Buddhism, of the different traditions, Mahayana and Theravada and so on, life story of the Buddha. And then we'll do a little bit, just introduce the idea of the different scopes or levels of practice that we can engage in. And then do a meditation on, what is it? I have to look. Meditation on, not impermanence, on suffering. Yes, it doesn't sound very attractive, but this is actually meditation on looking at the first noble truth of the Four Noble Truths the Buddha taught. You've probably heard of that. So it's actually a good start to looking at the Buddha's path generally. So let's, as usual, start with 4 or 5 minutes of mindfulness practice where we just get comfortable, relax the body, and adjust our motivation, and using our breathing as the object of mindfulness. So it's basically a mindfulness of breath practice to get us in the mood. Okay, just get comfortable. You can be sitting, lying, where the body is feeling most relaxed, to help the mind relax. Okay, now we begin by just bringing our attention into our inner world, letting go of our day that we've had, our busy day, whatever it was, all gone, finished. Bring our mind into the present. For this one hour and a half, as much as we can, focusing on the practice, the teachings, the amazing Buddhist teachings that we're so fortunate to have discovered and encountered. And now we can come together and just practice together, share the Dharma together. And we're doing our practice for the development and benefit of our minds. And by doing so, we benefit others, those around us, and ultimately, the big motivation is to become liberated from all our misunderstandings, our ignorance, become a fully enlightened being and lead others to that state. It's called the Mahayana motivation. Now we come to the body, just checking we're evenly balanced on the floor or the chair. Spine is straight. Shoulders relaxed. Eyes can be closed or open. Feeling the weight of the body on the chair or the floor. Letting go with each out-breath, surrendering to gravity. Nothing to hold on to. Time to let go. Breathing out all the physical tension in the body. Breathing out the mental busyness of the mind. And bringing our attention now to the breath, which is always there, and now we start to notice it. Nothing to change, just watch the rhythm of the breath in the body. Quietly resting on the breath, and also part of the mind checking, monitoring whether we are on the breath or have we wandered, been distracted. Noticing the distraction is good. We gently let go of the thought, the sound, patiently come back to the breath. One breath at a time, the full flow of the in-breath, full flow of the out-breath. Just relax. So just a reminder, anyone new, either watching the live stream or watching the video on YouTube, just notice my name there and my email address in the chat column. So if you want to join the group, receive the handouts, the notes, just send me an email and I'll put you on the list, no trouble. Okay, so just looking at the notes, and there's 4 things. Is the thing I've called the course outline, which just has the program for the next 4 weeks on one page. Noticing next week is public holiday, so just skip that. Then there's the reading list. Now the reading list, the course notes are always their starting point. Not that many. There's, I think, just 4 extracts there. Then there's a transcript, which is very long, I think 250 pages, which is a transcript of Rabina's teachings on the topic of presenting the path or introduction to Buddhism. So it's quite detailed. She taught the course, I think, over 8 or 10 weeks. She does talk 2.5 times faster than a normal person, I heard on their podcast that I listened to recently, which means that she packs a lot of words into each minute. But it's actually quite readable because Rabina has a very uncomplicated way of speaking. She doesn't use big words, lots of examples. So she's a fantastic teacher. So you can, if you don't want to read the whole lot, I don't think I have read the whole lot yet, you can actually, it's quite well edited with topic headings and subtopics. And so it's a good resource. Don't print it out unless you've got lots of paper and lots of ink. Then the third book I've got there is called Approaching the Path by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, edited by Thupten Chodron. Just hold it up so you can see it, Approaching the Path. So that's a fantastic book. It's probably only a few years old, and it's really good on the history of Buddhism and the different traditions, and it's available in digital copy as well as hard copy. So that's Practicing the Path. Becoming Enlightened, nice little book, which I've got and I have read. Got quite, it ranges from very introductory to quite advanced. The Buddha, I haven't read, by Karen Armstrong, Life Story of the Buddha in detail. I haven't read it, so but I believe it's very good. Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand by Pabonka Rinpoche is a standard text for Mahayana students. It's quite a high. It's actually teachings given by Pabonka Rinpoche, who was one of the Dalai Lama's teachers, given to monks in Tibet. So remember, this is before Tibet was overtaken by the Chinese, and it's perfect on the topic of lamrim, but it is quite advanced, probably a bit too advanced for this Discovering Buddhism course, but it's a good resource. Practicing the Path. Sorry, I just skipped over that. So Approaching the Path is the one by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Practicing the Path is a nice book by Yangshi Rinpoche, who's a Tibetan monk teaching in America, and it's a collection of his teachings on the lamrim. And we do use that quite a lot through the course, through the whole DB course. And if you wanted to buy a digital or hard copy, it's a good one to have. Then I just at the bottom, I just put a note there that the FPMT education site FPMT is the organisation that runs this course and runs the centres around the world, FPMT centres around the world. And they've got a terrific resource page on their website. And you can actually, even if you want to skip ahead with discovering Buddhism and do it quicker, you can actually buy the whole collection of notes and handouts and readings online, every one of the 13 modules. It's called Discovering Buddhism at Home. And it's not very expensive. I think it's about $20 or $30 per module. So that's, and also there's many other good resources there. There's courses that are a bit easier than Discovering Buddhism, and then there's more advanced courses, terrific collection of prayers and practices and teachings, particularly by Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Lamiashi. So that's the readings. Let's have a look now at tonight. So I've just, looking at the notes, I've just spent the first page just explaining that there are different ways and different approaches to looking at the overall teachings of Buddhism, presenting the path. Sometimes the path is called, it's called the lamrim in Tibetan. It's called the graduated path to enlightenment, quite often in English. And different methods, different ways of presenting the path. So if you look at the readings, just summarize what each of there's three extracts. The first reading by Lamiashi extract, he's explaining what the Buddhists taught during the three main sets of teachings that the Buddha gave over his lifetime, called the three turnings of the wheel. First turning, second turning, and third turning. And so it's only a few pages, but Lamiashi's very powerful teaching on the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. The second one, Geshe Sopa, a Tibetan who's teaching in America, or has taught in America for many, many decades. He's explaining the overall Buddhist teachings using the three principles of the path. And the three principles are renunciation. That means realizing that the situation that we're in now, in this human body, which is we're going to have to leave at the time of death, with much ups and downs in our mind, our happiness state, is not satisfactory. We need to do what Buddha did and leave the comfort of our everyday life, and not physically, but just make a decision to look for the truth and the practices, particularly in the Buddhist path. Great compassion, development of loving kindness for others, and the third one is wisdom, how things exist. The three main principles of the path, they call those. So that's the second way we hold of Buddhism. Third one, Nick Rebush, who runs the website called Lamiashi Wisdom Archive, very senior student, used to be a monk for many years. He's just giving a teaching from his own knowledge of Buddhism, dating back to the, I think, late 70s. And he's just using a different approach to, he's basically explaining what the very basic Buddhist concepts are, such as enlightenment, impermanence, karma, and so on. And then the Four Noble Truths are often used to look at the overall teachings of Buddha. And then finally, Rabina's approach, which is the one we're going to use for this module, is to look at the three different levels of practice. It's often called the three scopes. And we'll look at those, what they are, later tonight. Okay, so that's just to sort of explain a bit that okay, there's a few technical problems, I think. Thanks, Stacey and Mary, for letting me know. hopefully we're back. I'll keep going. And so that's just a little bit of introduction to the different possible approaches to looking at the lamrim, or the graduated path to enlightenment. So there was a text, a teaching given by the great master called Atisha, an Indian teacher existing in India around the 10th century, 980 to 1052 AD. So that's the very first text written, which we can call the beginning of the lamrim. So it's called The Lamp on the Path to Enlightenment. You can actually get a copy. I think it's probably available in many online. Lamp on the Path to Enlightenment. Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. So that teaching by Atisha just gathered many, many different teachings from the original Buddha's teaching, Shakyamuni Buddha, 500 BC, and presented in a condensed form, a condensed readable form. And this was later, so that's the very first lamrim text. Then later on, Lama Tsongkhapa, the great master who started the Gelugpa tradition, of which the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is the leader, the Gelugpa sect, and our centre, Vajrayana Institute, is Gelugpa Centre, teaching the Gelugpa tradition, Tibetan tradition. Lama Tsongkhapa wrote a longer version of the Lamp of the Path to Enlightenment called the Lamrim Chenmo, and that's regarded as really the base, the main text on lamrim. It's over 2 volumes, and it's probably too detailed and quite difficult to read in a way at this stage, but it's like the basic text on the lamrim for advanced students of that study. That's so that's just sort of the background, and the actual commentaries that I've mentioned in that reading list, including Pabonka's Liberation in Our Hands, and then all the other texts are really based on the Lamrim Chenmo by Lama Tsongkhapa. Oh, I'm back. Thank you. Thanks, Mary. So just a little bit there about what we need to actually approach the study of Buddhism, the Dharma. If I mention studying the Dharma, I mean actually the Buddhist path, and I mean actually the Buddhist path, and those 3 activities I've mentioned in the last module, that we listen to teachings, including reading, gathering information. Next, we reflect on what we've heard, thinking about those concepts, those arguments, and then meditating on those points. And so listening, reflecting, and meditating helps integrate the teachings into our own mind. And the constant message in Buddhist study is to check out with your own wisdom whether something is true or not. Buddha himself said, don't just believe something because I said so. He said, check up, and decide from your own reasoning, study, meditation, whether it's correct or not. So to do this, we need an open mind. And there's the 3 pots analogy. So the mind should not be closed off. That means the pot should not be upside down, but should be open to receive the teachings. And so it needs an open mind. So even if something's a new concept, doesn't maybe not be immediately digestible, we need to be open enough to admit it into our way of thinking and see whether it's true or not. Second one is a leaking pot, the one where the information comes into our mind, but we forget. Definitely something that I do often. But, so if we can hear something and hold on to it, which often means repeatedly listening or reading to a teaching, a lot of repetition in Buddhist study. And the last one is the dirty pot. So we're listening to the teachings, but we've got a motivation that we're going to use it something for some ulterior self-serving purpose. Maybe become a famous Buddhist teacher and make lots of money, something like that. So, so those three things we need to avoid and have good motivation and an open mind. And if something is not going to be something that just doesn't seem right at the moment, it could be the teachings or emptiness or reincarnation, we can leave them for the moment. This is often just put them aside and study other topics which we might have a much closer connection with. So we can leave those difficult topics and then come back, and probably it could be coming back months or years later. Those topics might be much easier to accept and digest and understand. So how is it possible for us to change our mind? We've actually looked at this in the earlier module when we looked at the mind and its potential. So we have the seed of Buddha nature. This is a very important concept, that our current state, where we have ups and downs, we have suffering and uncomfortableness and dissatisfaction, is those situations are mental states are temporary, like clouds in the sky. The sky itself is our Buddha nature. So our Buddha nature is unstained by the defilements and the obscurations and the negative emotions. Every living being, including insects or living beings, have Buddha nature, the potential to become enlightened if they can encounter the right conditions to develop their Buddha nature. So, fortunately, that we do have the conditions. This is the analogy of the soil. The seed needs the soil to germinate. This human body that we've got with human brain, able to reason, is the soil. We also, in a situation where we can have connection and access to the Buddhist teaching in a language we understand. We have access to teachers, great teachers such as Holiness and Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa, Lamiashi, and we have leisure time to actually be able to do some study and meditate. The water is the spiritual teachings themselves. They're available and in many different forms. And then the sun, to grow the seed, is our relationship with our spiritual teachers. So we'll talk about that as a separate topic, the relationship with our spiritual guides, because if that's strong, then we can make great progress very quickly. So the next thing, as an introductory thing, is to look at how all these conditions can actually bring about enlightenment. What is Buddhahood? First of all, what is enlightenment? What are we talking about? Rabin is very good at this. If you look at her transcript around about page 9 onwards, she was brought up Catholic and quite strict, went to a Catholic school. And so she was just like most of us who are brought up in Western environment, have some sort of Judeo-Christian background where we were taught to believe in God, or given the option of believing in God, or maybe had quite a strict upbringing in Christian tradition. So the idea of Buddhahood involves a mind that is faultless. So a mind that's faultless, we call it omniscience. And omniscience, Rabbeinu points out, is best translated as accurate cognition, seeing things as they are. So seeing physical phenomena as it is, impermanent, subject to causes and conditions, seeing mental phenomena, can read the minds of other beings, so it involves that, and seeing that what is needed to help other beings. So this is kind of ultimate wisdom, a mind that is completely undefiled and is clean, clear, so clean, clear that it can see exactly the way everything is. Then the other quality of the Buddha mind is, the enlightened mind, is unlimited compassion for all beings, being equally regarded with loving kindness by the Buddha mind. And so Rabbeinu asked the question, does this mean that we're trying to become God? And the answer really is not God in the sense of a creator. As Lamiashi says, the creator is ourselves. We create all our own causes of happiness and all our own causes of suffering. So we ultimately are the creator. So there's no other creator than our own mind. So this is quite a lot different to the Christian idea that the God creator created heaven and earth, and there doesn't seem to be any cause of the creator. The creator is uncreated, and there doesn't seem to be any cause of the creator. The creator is uncreated, and other things there. But there is quite a few, the similarity of a being who is all compassionate, very similar. Seems like very similar to the idea of God and Jesus. And then this idea of being able to understand everything. This idea of perfect cognition, accurate cognition of all things. But the other difference is that rather than giving ourselves over to the Buddha and expecting the Buddha to save us and transplant all his realizations into our own mind, we have to actually do some work ourselves. Okay, so the idea of savior, in the sense of saving us by just handing ourselves over to the Buddha, that doesn't apply. So we need to do some work, and so we need to do these things that we just mentioned: meditating, studying, contemplating, and so on, and actually applying the recipe to make the cake. If we're just studying the recipes and not actually making the cake, then we can't enjoy the delicious fruits of our labours. I'm quoting, not quoting, but paraphrasing Rabbeinu here. Unfortunately, that note is saying that connections unstable has come up again, so perhaps there is some problem with the sound. I hope not. I'll keep going. So our Buddha nature is behind all this, and because we have the potential to become a Buddha, that makes the whole effort worthwhile. We can see that there is a possibility of ridding ourselves, just as the Buddha himself did. And so that brings us to the last story. How did the Buddha become Buddha? So Buddha Shakyamuni, also called Siddhartha Gautama, born about 500 BC. This is some of the details we know, around Lumbini. Now, Lumbini is a Buddhist pilgrimage site in Nepal. It's just over the border from India in Nepal. And all that is, there's monasteries there, and there's a pillar called Ashoka's pillar, which is meant to be the spot where the Buddha was born. Quite a desolate area now, but the time of Buddha's birth apparently was very... So he was the son of king of that area at the time, and had a very privileged upbringing in the palace. And the king had earmarked him for his heir, and he was very, I was going to say spoiled, but it's probably not the right word, but very, very privileged, and he was not allowed to leave the palace. The king was frightened or wary that if he got out of the palace and saw the real world, he may not want to be king anymore. He might have other plans. And that's exactly what happened. So when he was, I think it was 28 or 9, he left the palace, escaped, and outside the palace he saw an old person, a corpse, and a wandering mendicant, what they call a sadhu in India, a person who's renounced everyday life and is just wandering, looking for enlightenment or meaning of life, just living an ascetic life, giving up the comforts of ordinary life. So these things he had never seen before, and seeing the sick person suffering, of course, and the old person also suffering, made him aware of the idea of the existence of suffering and old age, and of course the corpse of the existence of suffering and old age, and of course the corpse, the death, and everything that's living, including himself, will eventually die. So these realizations happened very quickly, and so he decided to give up the palace, give up the future kingship, and become a mendicant, which is a wandering ascetic, giving up virtually everything, treating his body very harshly, living on just the very bare minimum of food, clothes, just rags. There was a group of these ascetics which he joined, and he stayed with them for 6 years, and tried very hard to find spiritual realizations and truth, but found that all he was doing was getting weaker. And so after 6 years, he decided that this was not helping. And so he left that group. The group were very upset that he left, because they said he was succumbing to the temptations of a comfortable life. But in fact, the Buddha decided that he couldn't obtain realizations and spiritual development by torturing his body. Decided the best way was to go the middle way, which is give his body enough food and sustenance to be able to meditate and study and so on. The middle way, not going the other way of indulging himself in sensual pleasure, as he had been in the palace, but just to have enough food and clothing and so on, and shelter to look after the body. And then he sat under the Bodhi tree and made a strong decision, Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, which is in India, made a strong decision that he would not get up until he actually discovered the truth. And so after a certain number of times, I don't know how long he sat under the tree, but on the full moon of the 4th lunar month, age 35, he became an enlightened being. And that's what we call, that's the day we Sakyadawa, the day, although it's not completely sure as to what day it was, it's celebrated on that 4th lunar month. So that's the one version of the life story of the Buddha. So His Holiness says this is the story that is used by the Theravada tradition or the Pali tradition. Pali is the language that the Theravada tradition, the sutras are written in this language, and they're the ones that the Theravada tradition uses as authoritative text. The Mahayanas, the Tibetan Buddhists say that, have a slightly different version. They say the Buddha was already enlightened when he was born into the Shakyamuni Buddha, and he went through that that process of being born as a king and then leaving the palace and becoming enlightened for the benefit of others, those around. He's actually already a previous he was previously enlightened, so it was like a performance. And there have been countless Buddhas before him, and there will be countless. So a slightly different approach. But the story of the Bodhi tree and so on is accepted by both traditions. Excuse me while I just have a sip of water. For more information on this, I can recommend the book Approaching the Path, and the Dalai Lama gives a very good, more detailed account of Buddha's journey to enlightenment. So Buddhism in the West is recent, so it really only has happened. There are a few early explorers in the early 20th century who went to Tibet, and some of them wrote biographies, some of them brought texts back, like the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, from Tibet. But it wasn't really until the Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1949, and then the exile of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I think 1959, when His Holiness and many of the great teachers, his tutors and so on, came to India as refugees, and brought other monks, followed from various monasteries, and they became formed a community in northern India, Dharamsala, and then they set up under His Holiness Dalai Lama's guidance, set up monasteries in southern India after being given land by the Indian government. So the Indian government was a good host to the Tibetan refugees. His Holiness often praises the Indian government for their kindness, and so from there, the teachers, some of whom were interested in teaching Westerners, most of them weren't, we hear. Most of them thought the Westerners were just so overcome by materialism, living in such affluent societies, that they weren't going to be interested in Buddhism. But some of them had a different view and wanted to, or were open to teaching Westerners. Lamiashi and Lama Zopa are the two monks who actually came to found this organization, FPNT, after being requested by Westerners who traveled to Nepal and India. The first meeting of Lama Zopa and Lamiashi, and the first West contact from the West, was by a woman called Zina. She was related to Russian aristocracy, or the Russian royal family. And she was traveling through India, Darjeeling, in the 50s or 60s, anyway, around about that time. And she met Lama Zopa and Lamiashi, had recently fled Tibet, and they were living in a house in Darjeeling. And she found out that they were there, and she asked them to if they would teach her. And of course, language is a problem, because neither Lamiashi or Lama Zopa spoke very much English, so they had to use translator. And Lamiashi wasn't interested at first, so Lamiashi said Lama Zopa was interested, and so he said, if you're interested, yes, teach Zina. And so Zina spent some months in Darjeeling getting teachings from Lama Zopa, and then Lamiashi began to teach as well. And so that was the beginning. Zina had lots of friends around her. She led quite a wild life. had quite a bit of money at the time, so she was paying to how some of her friends were getting teachings as well. So from there, she and some other students found a place. She wanted them to be able to teach more often and more regularly. So they found this old building in Kathmandu, which was actually owned by the government, the king's astrologer. And that's Copan Monastery now today. So those early years, Lama Zopa and Lamiashi taught students, probably from, I think it was from the late 60s, early 70s, that Westerners began to go to this place up on the hill, Copan Hill, just outside Kathmandu, and they developed the routine of having regular teachings. The Copan annual course was established, which happens still right to today in November every year. So it's much more comfortable now, but in the early days, I went in the early 80s to a Copan course. It was extremely difficult. There was almost no accommodation. We were sleeping on the bare floors of where the monks used to sleep, diarrhea and hepatitis, all kinds of things. But nowadays, the actual place is much more comfortable, more westernized. So gradually, as students returned to their countries after they travelled through India, encountered the teachings, the Dharma, through Lamiashi and Lama Zopa, they went back to their own countries, Australia, America, England, and gradually set up centres there. And through communicating with Lama Zopa and Lamiashi, they would teach. Tibetan monks were sent over to teach in these centres, in these Western centres. So the first one in Australia was Chenrezig Institute, set up in the early 70s. Still there, beautiful place, Chenrezig, in the hinterland of the Sunshine Coast. Then I think the next one after that might have been either Melbourne or Adelaide. Sydney was quite late. Sydney only started, the centre, the Vajrayana Institute started in the early 80s. Venerable Roger, who was the attendant of Lama Zopa at the moment, and has been for decades, he set up the centre in Sydney. He set up the centre in Sydney. And so gradually, all these centres around the world grew in number. Many hundreds now exist in many different countries around the world. So that's only happened since the arrival of Buddhism really only started in the West in the 60s, 70s. And so it's only in the last 30 or 40 years that Westerners have had access to the Dharma and in a language they understand. And that's only happened in the last, probably since the 80s. It's quite difficult in even the early 80s to find texts with Tibetan Buddhist teachings that were in English. There were very few. And now, of course, there are many languages, English, and in many formats. Now, just a little bit about the different Buddhist schools. Again, I refer you to His Holiness the Dalai Lama's book, Approaching the Path. He gives a really interesting history and run through how Buddhists propagated from the 500 BC and soon after the Buddha passed away. The teachings just gradually spread to all those countries there on page 4. Sri Lanka, I think might have been India, of course, where it was established. It went as far as Indonesia, then to Mongolia up north, Japan, Tibet, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Many of those 2,000 years, really, from 500 BC right up until Tibet arrived in Tibet. I think it was around about 700 AD. Not so good on dates. So there were many different schools. So as the Buddhist, originally the teachings were all oral. There was nothing written down. And so what happened was soon after the Buddha passed away, these groups of what they call arhats, which are beings who are have reached a very high attainment of realization, they were divided up into groups to memorize the Buddha's teachings and to pass their memories by verbal recitations and teaching orally down for the next few centuries. And so it wasn't until, I think, this is according to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the 1st century AD in Sri Lanka, that these verbal transmissions were actually put in writing, and the writing was in Pali. So that's the first written evidence, those Pali teachings in Sri Lanka, of the Buddhist discourses. So this is part of the reason. There's really, nowadays, we can divide the Buddhist traditions really just into two. There were 40 at one stage, 18 different schools in various parts of the world, from Afghanistan, Japan, Indonesia, and so on. So they went to schools in various parts of the world, from Afghanistan, Japan, Indonesia, and so on. So they weren't competing with each other. His Holiness explains that they were just changing the teachings as they change cultures and climate. So just as right now Buddhism is being assimilated into the West, it's changing. The culture, His Holiness is always emphasizing that we don't need to import the culture of Tibet. We don't need to wear Tibetan clothes, and we can adapt the various rituals and so on to our own culture. And so even though the heart of the Buddhist teaching is the same, the Four Noble Truths and so on, the trappings, the paintings, the iconography and so on will change with each civilization. So just read you one paragraph of the chapter where the Dalai Lama explains the spread of Buddha Dharma and the different Buddhist traditions. He said, "Not all people think alike. They have different needs, different interests, dispositions in almost every area of their lives, including religion." So in this light, the Buddha, a skillful teacher, gave multiple teachings to correspond to the variety of sentient beings. And as the Buddha Dharma spread across the Indian continent and into other lands, people had access to different sutras. They found certain teachings more suitable for their minds than teachings in other sutras. So in this way, multiple Buddhist traditions came about. And the development of these traditions and their presentations were also influenced by economic, political situations in each land, as well as climate, social structure, political situations, so on, language and culture. So while the Buddhist teachings share the Four Noble Truths, their selection of text, their imagery, ritual, points of emphasis, and religious institutions were influenced by the society in which they were produced. So this has always happened, and it's happening now as the Buddhist teachings have reached the West and are now being integrated into the Western culture. So that's really important, I think, point to realize that nowadays we can really, this idea that there are two main traditions, what His Holiness calls the Pali tradition, which is also called the Theravadan tradition. That's the Buddhism that is practiced in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, probably another one, but I can't. And then that's the Theravadan tradition based on these Pali sutras. And then there's the Theravada, the Mahayana tradition taught by the Tibetans, and also the Vietnamese tradition is Mahayana. It's the Mahayana tradition, where the Sanskrit texts are the basis of the tradition. The Sanskrit taught in the Sanskrit language, Mongolia, Mahayana, and Japan, Mahayana. So these words, Mahayana and Theravada, as Holiness says, probably didn't exist until fairly recently. And so this idea that they're two very different traditions of Buddhism, he says, is not correct. He says there are even now people from the Theravadan countries such as Thailand, Sri Lanka, who are practicing some form of the Mahayana, and then there are some people in the Mahayana Tibetan tradition, who are actually getting teachers from teachers in the Theravadan traditions. So he thinks Theravada might be a 20th century term, even that recent. So just really the point of that history of the schools is to just realize that there's a lot, and it's not clear exactly how the traditions develop. Everybody's memory and history is slightly different. And also that this division into Theravada and Mahayana shouldn't be taken too strictly. The actual rituals can be quite different in the Theravada and the Mahayana, but many of the teachings are the same, and the Four Noble Truths are a good example, exactly the same really in both traditions. So 7 o'clock, so just traditions. So 7 o'clock, so just going to touch on these different levels that we can practice the Buddhist teachings at these different levels. So we're going to really cover this mainly in the next 3 weeks, but just introducing what they mean, the idea of 3 scopes. So the 3 scopes really refer to the mental disposition of students. So the initial level of practice is for the student who realizes that this situation that we're in the human body can be improved, that it's not perfect, so that and also it could be worse. That's probably the most important point, that we're actually born in a human body, but there are other bodies we could have been born into, such as the animal realm. So this being person at the initial level has knowledge and acceptance and realization of the different realms of beings, particularly the lower realm, and the disadvantages of being in the lower realm. So they want to make sure that everything they do in the rest of this life, what's left of this life in the human body, is going to lead to as good or better rebirth in the next realm. So if we've got, as we have at the moment, if we're lucky enough to be born in Australia with access to the Buddhist teaching, we can wish that our next body is human, and we also can continue our Dharma practice. So we're seeking a favourable rebirth, and then in the next favourable rebirths to come, we can gradually practice and travel the path to become liberated from all negative states of mind and all negative states of existence. So it's the person of initial scope wants a favourable rebirth. They're not looking far enough ahead to have no more rebirths and be completely liberated, which is what the middle level of practice is. The middle level of practice, you can see that another human rebirth is not is not going to solve the problem. That we're still basically in a situation where we can still, under the influence of negative emotions, negative ignorance, attachment, and anger, and so on. And so we need to completely purify our mind so that there is no defilements whatsoever, and become fully liberated so that we can choose our rebirth. We don't have to be subject to what they call samsara, the cycle of birth, sickness, aging, and death, and then going back to possibly a less favourable rebirth. So the middle level practitioner is going for the much higher goal of complete liberation from suffering in the future, complete purification of their minds, where they become beyond the influence of karma and delusion. That's the liberated being, and that's the goal that's usually associated with Theravajan beings. They want to become liberated. Then the high level of practice is the Mahayana motivation. Beings who can see that the initial level of practice is going to lead to more, not going to solve the problem. Middle level of practice will end all suffering for the practitioner, but the practitioner who's liberated is not going to be able to help other beings who themselves are not liberated. So there needs to be a motivation of becoming a liberated being to be able to develop and come back and help those beings who are not yet liberated and out of samsara. That's called the mind of enlightenment, the Mahayana Dharma, and that's the basic level that the Tibetan Buddhists are aiming at, Tibetan Buddhist Mahayana practitioners. However, as Rabina explained, it's not possible to just decide what level you're going to practice at, and all beings who are practice at, and all beings who are at the high level now, motivated by becoming enlightened for the benefit of all other beings, they have had to have practiced at the initial level and then the middle level, and to get to the highest level. The analogy she uses, and which is often used, is the three level of our mundane worldly education: primary school, high school, university. If we do well at primary, we can go on to high school. High school, we graduate and go to university. And so we don't just go straight to university and start practice expecting to be successful at university. And so we don't just go straight to university and start practice expecting to be successful. So we need a basic education. We build on that. So all those beings who say are practicing at are good practitioners at the high level also have to have practiced and had realization at the initial level. So that's just, we're going to come back to that. So just sort of touching on the meaning of those three levels. Next week we'll go into detail to the initial level of practitioner. And we can have degrees of these motivations, states of mind, reasons for practicing Buddhism in our mind, or at the same time. We can have a wish to practice at the high level, where in fact we might be more at the middle level, or we might be in fact at the initial level, or we might have different ups and downs. We might have times where we actually have realizations at the high level. So just so we've got enough time to do the meditation on the first noble truth, which is the truth of suffering. We'll start that now. So just a bit of an outline of this meditation. The main reason, and the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths as his first, if we have some illness, we first need to realize that before we go to the doctor and get medicine. If we think we're perfectly healthy, but in fact we have some disease that is not showing any symptoms, then if we think we're perfectly healthy, but in fact we have some disease that is not showing. So this First Noble Truth teaches us to look carefully at our situation and the different types of problems, even if we're in a very privileged and quite comfortable situation on the surface, as we are if we're lucky enough to be born now in this particular country at this particular time, then we can look at deeper and see that in fact there are many problems still here. So this, the First Noble Truth is telling us that suffering exists not just in the obvious physical type, which is getting sick, what Buddhists saw when he left the temple, not the temple, the palace. He saw someone sick, someone old, and someone a corpse. So that's the first type of suffering that we all can appreciate. We all have had experience of being sick, and not just physically, having mental days where we're feeling depressed or agitated or anxious. We've all lost loved ones if we're older, and we all know that our life, at some stage we're going to have to leave this body, and our own death will happen. So that's called the first suffering, the suffering of suffering. And the word suffering doesn't necessarily mean, we usually think of someone being tortured or having some sort of physical thing done to them. Lamiashi explains the feeling of not being whole, the feeling that something's missing, this mental thinking of that we're incomplete. That is a very common symptom of the suffering of suffering, the physical dissatisfaction. And he explains that it comes from attachment, wanting, holding on to small experiences of pleasure, and expecting them to last, looking for our happiness in these small experiences of pleasure. It could be physical pleasure, food, could be the perfect job, the perfect partner, the perfect house, the perfect holiday. So that's the second type of suffering, where we in Western society, consumers, in capitalist society, we're brainwashed to think that these small pleasures are actually the source of happiness. And Second Noble Truth tells us that they're actually the source of suffering. They will give us some relief, some temporary relief, but like the aspirin, which masks the pain of the body, the actual cause of the pain has not been tackled. It's still the cause of the pain, which in Buddhist terms is called karma and delusion. Karma and delusions, karma and mental obscuration. So the third type of suffering is the underlying cause of the first two. The second type is called suffering of change, sometimes exemplified by when we're hot, we move into the cooler shade, and then we get cold and we have to move back into the heat. And so there's this constant change from feeling comfortable and then starting to feel uncomfortable, feeling hungry, then eating, and then overeating and feeling uncomfortable. So that's the sort of very elementary way of explaining that second type of suffering. Third type of suffering is our not understanding how things exist. So not having the wisdom to see that everything is impermanent and subject to causes and conditions. The wisdom realizing emptiness is what it's called. So emptiness meaning that nothing has any inherent essence, and so it can never provide material satisfaction. So when we realize this in our minds, in a very profound way, how things exist, we have Buddha mind. No more suffering, we're enlightened. So just to sum it up, it's a quotation from a great teacher called Aryadeva. How can one who has no weariness for cyclic existence aspire for peace? Like their households, it will be difficult to leave. Okay? So if we don't realize where we are in terms of this samsaric existence, we're not going to actually be aspiring to get out of the comfortable house. We'll be like the Buddha when he's in the palace and he doesn't have the wish. He's so overcome by the luxury and comfort, he doesn't have any wish to leave the house. Fortunately, the Buddha did have so the wish to leave by the luxury and comfort. He doesn't have any wish to leave the house. Fortunately, the Buddha did have so the wish to leave the house and discover the truth. So, what we do in the actual meditation is we think of the three different categories of suffering and just contemplate, rest our mind. The first one is the physical one I've mentioned. Second one is suffering of change, which is much harder to detect. That's the things that we actually go for now in our unenlightened state of mind for comfort and satisfaction. And we're looking at them in a much more detailed way, much more carefully. So that's second type of suffering, and then suffering of conditioning or change. And then the last one is the all-pervasive suffering, which is being unenlightened beings and being subject to uncontrolled birth, which is uncontrolled rebirth, caused by not understanding what's called ignorance, not understanding how things exist. Okay, so we'll do a brief meditation. It's already 7:15. So get sitting, lying down, whatever is physically the best for your body. Relax. In a few moments, focusing on the breath. By contemplating the three different types of suffering that we are subject to as unenlightened beings. The first one, the suffering of suffering, the easy one. The suffering of suffering covers our day-to-day pain, injuries, discomfort in the physical body, sickness, imbalance, feeling too hot, too cold, feelings of mental discomfort, tiredness, anxiety, fear, stress, our mental ups and downs. It also covers aging of the body, something as young people we probably didn't think would happen. These are things we experience as the limbs, the organs age, the mind becoming more forgetful, and then the ultimate suffering of suffering is when we have to leave our body. The reality that death will definitely happen. A time when we have to leave our body. The time of death uncertain. We don't know exactly when. The third truth about death is the only thing that will help at the time of death is our state of mind. peaceful state of mind will have a favourable death and a favourable rebirth. Unpeaceful state, unfavourable rebirth. Suffering, second type of suffering, the suffering of change. If we take a painkiller, then we get relief compared to what we felt before. But the relief does not last. This suffering of change is the type of happiness we try to extract from the world in our everyday life. Sense of income. What pervasive suffering is the fact that we're to our past actions, called karma, and subject to our current delusions, misunderstanding, ignorance, negative emotions. So the negative effects of our past actions and our current negative states of mind will lead us to further suffering and dissatisfaction, unsatisfactory stage. The underlying cause is a lack of understanding of how things exist. Not understanding that all phenomena, mental, physical, who we are, lacks any essence or concrete inherent existence. On the contrary, you feel this self, this me, exists independently, concretely. And implied is that this self is more important than other beings, and we work for self rather than others. With this underlying dissatisfaction caused by not understanding how things exist, including ourselves. So until we realize this treadmill, this samsaric existence, unenlightened beings, can be actually brought to an end, we will continue to be in this cycle. Once we realize that we can actually change where we're going by understanding that positive actions of body, speech and mind create positive effects, negative actions create negative effects. Ignorant mind causes suffering, enlightened mind causes liberation. Then we can change our states, the way we think, make a decision to, as much as possible, avoid creating further negative action, avoid as much as possible states of anger, attachment, miserliness, as much as possible create loving kindness, patience, compassion. So this realization that if we know the path to liberation, lamrim is the path to liberation, then we can practice it, create the causes for future happiness, future liberation, future enlightenment. That's while we're studying the path to enlightenment. So finally, we can just dedicate any positive merit from meditation, from tonight's teaching, all the positive actions we've done in the past and the practices we've done in the past and we will do in the future towards our progressing along the path to liberation, along the path to enlightenment, to ultimately have perfect understanding of how things exist, wisdom, compassion, and be able to lead all other beings to enlightenment. Also, just reading Lama Zopa's special dedication for the pandemic. However many sick sentient beings there are, may they quickly be freed from all sickness. May all the sickness without exception of all transmigrating beings never occur again. May the Buddha Dharma last for a long time. May sentient beings in this world meet the Buddha Dharma and achieve enlightenment as quickly as possible. Dedicated to that. Okay, that's it for tonight. Thanks for being there. Hopefully the connection kept going. I noticed there has been some semi-disruption, but hopefully you got most of it. So thanks so much. Have a great night. And everyone have a good week. Thank you, Paul. And remember, no teachings next week, but I'll see you the Monday after next. Okay, so all the best and stay well.